Uh, Outside, I believe we have a couple of altars already done. One for Barbara and one for, who's your altar for? Yeah. Oh, for a few different people. And there's a couple of pictures up here from different people. You have your parents up here? Yeah, and I have my grandfather and my grandmother and her two sisters and my dad who just passed away a year ago this week. So the title of my sermon is Life Lived is Not to be Grieved. And that may be hard for some of us to hear. Yesterday was All Hallows Eve, and today is All Saints Day, and tomorrow is All Souls Day, or Day of the Dead. When we recall those we have lost and have been missing over the years, it seems strange, but we as a church only seem to talk about death twice a year unless it's a funeral. We talk about it at this time and around Easter. Good Friday, kind of the topic, kind of goes with the day. As Christians, technically, we believe that death is a joyous occasion, technically, although we rarely act like it. People have moved from this physical plane to the spiritual, shedding the mortal coil. Yet we mourn the physical loss of a loved one, and we mourn the gap that we perceive from the lack of their presence. Working in hospice and serving as a chaplain, I see death probably more casually than most, more often than a lot of people. And I work with people who are constantly in the process of dying, and some who are acutely aware of it, and others who are not so much. I have worked with the police where death is often comes suddenly, even though it's kind of part of the job and is expected. It is still a surprise and a shock when it happens. One of my favorite professors would often be heard saying to his classroom that it's not a matter of if we die, but a matter of when. And we kind of forget that, and so we get all caught up into our own lives. I often see dying not so much as a physical process, though it is, but often it's a spiritual process, one that you can see happening. There seems to be a pattern that often arises in the dying process. A person will, in what we assume often, or people assume often as a delusional state, will often speak of leaving, having to catch the bus, having packed their bags for travel. Oftentimes you hear this a week or two before they pass. Something deeper is happening when we're in the process of dying. Our spirits become much more aware of what's happening than necessarily we are of our own physical process. Often animals start behaving a little differently. They can sense it in someone better than we can ourselves. Often, like a dog is trained to sense a seizure, often animals can sense when somebody is dying and will react so, often spending more time by the side of the person. I have an excerpt from a story that I wanted to read. I was going to just bring the book out here and read it, but I decided to copy and paste it right in here so I had it handy. It's from a special home for people who are suffering from Alzheimer's. And this is a quote from the doctor. The doctor wrote the book. It was time to stop. I had now spoken to half a dozen people whose loved ones had died with Oscar by their side. I had plumbed their memories and emotions and learned a lot more about what Alzheimer's does to families, but I was still surprised by how little I knew about Oscar. I didn't feel frustrated, though. While I didn't feel enlightened necessarily, I did feel oddly elated. The image I was left with was that of Oscar walking Cindy Viveros down the hall, sitting with her in the darkened dining area, as he had done with her mother in her final days. Maybe that's all he was. A companion, a sentient being who might accompany one person on their journey to the next world, or another through the grief of losing one they had loved to a kind of underworld of its own. Wasn't that enough? Did it matter if he had some extrasensory power of perception? If he could pick up on impending mortality before the best of minds of medicine could? Maybe he was just a master of empathy. Maybe caring was his superpower. I decided I needed to talk to Mary. I've been thinking about what you said, that Oscar has 41 family members, and when one of them is in trouble, he goes and stays with them. It was a little before 3 in the afternoon, and Mary and I were sitting on her office. She had asked the staff to assemble at the nurse's desk in 3, and I had arrived in time to get a few words in with her before changing of the guard. The worries of our last encounter, the last funding crisis, the Sisyphean task of running the floor of this nursing home seemed to have vanished, and she was looking calm and collected. She also was being quite modest as she said, "Oh, David, that's just my theory. What do I know? You have to remember, I'm an dying wool animal lover. It's not like I'm objective." Objectivity has its limits, I replied. Remember, I started out not as believing in Oscar. To be honest, I thought you guys were all a little crazy. You know what the sign says, she said. You don't have to be crazy to work here, but it helps. But now I think that Oscar has some purpose, he goes on to explain. Maybe he's meant to help the resident, the family members, as you put it, but also the family. They may be the one who suffers, the families who may be the ones who suffer the most. And Mary went on to explain, don't forget the staff. You can't work up here and not become involved with the lives of your patients. We come to love these people. Their losses grieve us too, and in the end, we often become so close spiritually and emotionally to these patients as their own family members. Does it help that I have seen so many die with Alzheimer's, I asked? Does it make it any easier? She thought for a minute before answering. It makes it easier to understand what's happening, she said finally, but not why. Why would anyone be afflicted with this? Why would God let this happen? Now, though we seldom touched, he goes on to explain on the subject of religion, I took a chance and asked her, do you pray, Mary? I mean, have you asked God why? She smiled without directly answering the question. She said, I don't think he'd answer right away. And I thought, no, he'll take a message and maybe get back to you. And as I said before, the thing you have to remember about domesticated animals, Mary said, is that people started to keep them because they had a purpose. They worked. If you were a dog, you were herding. Sheep or something. Any cat that wasn't doing some serious mousing wasn't worth the food that was being given. It wasn't to be left to farm. They had to earn their keep. So I asked, is Oscar's job to take care of people? Mary shrugged. Why not? Maybe he's just more highly evolved than the other cats. Maybe it's his way of paying the rent. She checked her watch and smiled at me. We're all just guests here, you know. That's an excerpt from Making the Rounds with Oscar, which is a short novel of true stories of a doctor who the cat would often go in the room 2 or 3 days before the patient was dying, would not leave the room until the patient had passed away. And then that cat would follow the family members around the nursing home until they were gone, offering comfort and care. Otherwise, you couldn't touch the cat. It wouldn't let you pet it. It was a cat. It's a very cute story, but it just gives you a hint of how even animals have a sense. And Bob spoke about the elephants and how they pay attention when somebody has died. There's a video that shows how they come back to the site where the queen of the elephants had passed away the year before. And the elephants surround her with their backs facing her and kick their back feet towards her. Then they caress her bones, and then they go on their way again. So we are all just guests here. I've also heard it said, don't ask me, I'm only visiting this planet. This reading is about a daycare cat that purpose in life is to accompany those about to die. He seems to know long before there are any signs, and the staff at the nursing house specializing in Alzheimer's have come to trust the cat. Eventually, the doctor who wrote the book does as well. The book doesn't offer any answers to why we must die or why we must suffer, or is there God? It does say that when the time comes, the body and the spirit make a shift that is noticeable. For some reason, this cat could sense it. All Souls Day, we celebrate those who have passed. So, of course, we get the dead guy gospel today. In the gospel, it says, the dead man came out, his feet bound and his hands tied and his face covered with a cloth. And I was wondering, what does that mean today in our discussion about death, dying, and remembering those who've gone before and celebrating their lives? I can't help but to think of more of Terence McNally's interpretation from the Corpus Christi, which we've seen so many times, especially here. Quote, Simon says, there was an old man named Lazarus. He had been dead for 6 days and was starting to smell to high heaven. He had a wife and 6 daughters, and I wish you could hear the racket they were making. And at this time, the whole cast is screaming as loudly as possible, slowly getting louder. If you've seen it, you really know that that cast can scream. Joshua says, arise, Lazarus. Simon explains, I think this was one of the more practical miracles. I mean, there was no big reason for it. Lazarus wasn't a big cheese or even especially nice guy. Joshua just couldn't stand the noise anymore. Shut up, woman, and thank you. I say, Lazarus, arise. Lazarus comes forth and says, what is the matter with you? You'd think you'd seen a ghost. Of course, everybody had screamed at that moment. But Joshua, here's the important part, goes on to say, you have been asleep. Lazarus, not just for 6 days, but for all the years of your life. Now live as if your life was depending upon it. And Lazarus says, how do I live? Teach me. And Joshua says, be awake every moment and give thanks to God for it. Give back as much, no more, than you have been given. And laugh. Fill your lungs with good air and pray. You have all forgotten how to pray. In the gospel, it speaks of Lazarus being physically bound. But in the play, Terence kind of clears this up by saying that Lazarus has really been bound all his life. He has been squandering it. How often are we moving from paycheck to paycheck, from this need to that need, from this desire to that desire, from one project to another without stopping, looking and being present to it? There's nothing wrong with moving through life. That's what we're supposed to do. But if we're doing it as just a function, we're missing something. If we're doing it just as a function, is that really living? At this time when we remember our loved ones, friends and family, we do not recall how they went to work. We usually don't think about the groceries that they spent time buying, or when they were just sitting around reading a newspaper, or when they went to bed. We actually recall the good times. We recall those loving moments, the special meals we shared, the joys and yes, the sorrows. We remember them dancing or singing. We remember them caring for us. You know, we actually celebrate their lives. We don't, now that we're separated enough from it, we don't mourn the loss anymore. It's time now to start celebrating. Every year it becomes easier to just celebrate the lives they lived. Not the chores they'd done. We often think of dying as the end. And it is the end of our interaction with that person we loved, face to face. That part of our life will never be the same again, and we can never happen with that person again. We grieve the loss of the persona. We grieve the part of ourselves that kind of went with them, because that special part can no longer be. Not physically, anyways. We grieve the missing part, but we don't grieve the life lived. We celebrate the life lived. And so, as a final thought, I want to say, as Joshua said, live your lives. Take a moment and be present to what is happening to you day in and day out. When you're functioning through the worst of it or the best of it, take a moment and just pause. Take a moment to laugh. Let those you love and care about now know it every day. When they are gone, we celebrate that life. As we do today, we celebrate the lives lived, not lives lost. So as Troy Perry might say, my dearest saints, happy All Saints' Day. May we live as well as those we care about, who we celebrate today, lived, full of joy, full of life. Amen.